Hi, I'm Imi. I'm the author of Mapping the Human Mind. I've been reading a chapter of my book each week. This week is actually one of my favourite chapters. Chapter 9, A City of Splendour, Sensory Power and Divine Authority. To step into Constantinople at its height was to step into something closer to myth than reality. The city didn't just exist, it performed. Gold shimmered from mosaic walls, incense clung to every breath, and sunlight slipped through the Hagia Sophia's dome like liquid divinity. Not only a capital, but a cosmic stage. At the heart of it all stood the emperor, cloaked in imperial purple, stitched with threads of gold, adorned with jewels so extravagant they could ransom a kingdom. A sign of power, yes, but choreographed, theatrical, and deliberate. Imagine the Hagia Sophia in full ceremonial mode. Clouds of incense curling through the air, choirs echoing off marble walls, and the emperor entering not as a mere ruler, but as the living symbol of divine order. It wasn't God above and emperor below, it was side by side, as if the heavenly hierarchy had taken root in the soil of empire. Constantinople wasn't playing church and state. It was fusing them into a new kind of reality. Theology was policy. Ceremony was propaganda. Every processional, every chant, every jewelled garment was part of an immersive ritual designed to make the people believe that their emperor was not only chosen by God, he might be the next best thing to a divine colleague. Not equal, but undeniably in the inner circle. Think Numenor before the fall. Radiant, resplendent, and utterly convinced of its divine destiny. A city so enchanted by its own beauty and favour that it felt invincible. But like Numenor, Constantinople's grandeur carried with it the weight of illusion. Power dazzled, but it also distorted, and behind the incense and iconography, deeper tensions stirred. But this spectacle wasn't just for show, it was strategy. Every detail, from the glint of gold leaf to the echo of liturgy, was part of a psychological script. All wasn't accidental, it was engineered. The psychological architecture of power. The Byzantines didn't just build buildings, they were constructing experiences designed to hack your brain's perception of power and divinity. Let's take the Hagia Sophia as the ultimate case study in architectural mind control. When you first walked in, the transition from the bright Mediterranean sunlight to the dim, incense-filled interior created a momentary blindness. As your eyes adjusted, the space seemed to expand impossibly, the dome floating above like it was suspended from heaven itself. Not only cool-looking architecture, it was deliberately designed to disorient you, to make you feel small and overwhelmed. The gold mosaics covering the walls and ceilings weren't just bling for bling's sake. They were strategically positioned to catch and reflect the limited light from high windows, creating an effect where images of Christ, the Emperor, and the saints seemed to shimmer and move as if alive. In an age before electricity, it was as close to a hologram as you could get. Talk about special effects, Michael Bay would be taking notes. The acoustics were another mind hack. The shape of the dome was designed to amplify and distort sound, making even whispered prayers echo mysteriously. When the emperor or patriarch spoke, their voice seemed to come from everywhere at once. Not just impressive, but supernatural to the medieval mind. Even the famous Byzantine court ceremonies were psychological operations. Foreign ambassadors were often kept waiting for hours in rooms designed to intimidate, then led through a labyrinth of increasingly opulent spaces, each transition calculated to increase awe and anxiety. By the time they actually met the emperor, reportedly seated on a throne that could mechanically rise into the air while golden mechanical lions roared, they were psychologically primed to accept Byzantine superiority. But far from mere display, it functioned as a ritualized performance of supremacy that left no room for doubt. The message was clear. This is not just another human government, this is something transcendent. And it worked. For centuries, Constantinople maintained authority over diverse populations, not just through force, but through carefully cultivated awe. The Information Empire. While the rest of medieval Europe was still figuring out which end of the sword to hold, Constantinople was running the ancient world's equivalent of the CIA, complete with diplomatic mind games that would make modern politicians look like amateurs at a poker night. The Byzantine diplomatic corps was a finely tuned machine. It was an extensive network of spies, informants, and ambassadors stretching from the Viking territories to China. Not your typical message carriers, they were highly trained professionals, versed in languages, cultural customs, and psychological manipulation. Byzantine ambassadors assessed military strengths, identified potential allies, and sowed discord among enemies, all while maintaining a pleasant smile and distributing expensive gifts. And speaking of gifts, the Byzantines turned gift-giving into psychological warfare. When foreign dignitaries visited Constantinople, they'd receive presents so lavish they bordered on ridiculous. Silk robes that cost more than their entire village, mechanical golden birds that sang automatically, or clockwork devices that seemed like actual magic in the 9th century. But these were not generous party favours. They were calculated demonstrations of Byzantine technological and economic superiority. You can just imagine somebody saying, "Nice sword you've got there. Here's a self-operating golden tree with singing mechanical birds. No big deal. We make them for the kids." Information control was another Byzantine speciality. Long before anyone thought about classified documents, Constantinople had mastered the art of selective information sharing. Certain technologies like the famous Greek fire, a mysterious incendiary weapon that could burn even on water, were state secrets guarded more closely than the imperial treasury. The manufacture of silk was similarly protected. Smuggling silkworms out of the empire was punishable by death. Talk about extreme copyright protection. But the real masterpiece of Byzantine information management was how they played their neighbours against each other. Need to deal with a threatening tribe of nomadic warriors? Why fight them when you can subtly encourage them to attack your other enemies instead? Byzantine diplomats excelled at redirecting threats, creating buffer states, and making generous friendship payments, don't call them bribes, to potential enemies. Armed with intelligence from the Byzantine Ministry of Foreign Affairs, known evocatively as the Bureau of Barbarians, they gathered vast knowledge about both foes and allies. The emperor understood that warfare was expensive and risky, while clever diplomacy was cheap and effective. The result was an empire that sometimes seemed to defy gravity, maintaining influence even when its military was stretched thin or its economy under pressure. Constantinople weaponized information, perception, and psychology. It was soft power before anyone had invented the term. Life beyond the palace walls. While emperors and patriarchs were busy with their gold mosaics and theological debates, ordinary Constantinopolitans were living lives that might surprise us with how weirdly relatable they were. The city, while home to the elite, was also a buzzing metropolis of around 500,000 people at its height, making it the medieval world's version of New York City. The narrow streets of residential neighbourhoods were packed with multi-storey apartment buildings called insulae, where families lived in close quarters, often directly above shops and workshops. Imagine living in a fifth-floor walk-up with your extended family, the smell of the baker's shop below wafting up through your floorboards, and your neighbours' marital disputes serving as your evening entertainment. Some aspects of urban living never change. The The real heart of everyday Constantinople wasn't the Great Palace or even the Hagia Sophia, it was the markets. The Mise, the main street running through the city, was lined with shops selling everything from spices to silks, books to baubles. Shopping was only part of the equation, though. It was social networking, Byzantine style. Here you'd catch the latest gossip, from scandalous palace rumours to complaints about rising bread prices. The marketplace was social media without the screens. And speaking of entertainment, Byzantines knew how to party. The Hippodrome, designed not only for the emperor's ceremonies, was where ordinary citizens gathered to watch chariot races, the NASCAR of its day. The population was divided into demes or chariot racing fan clubs, primarily the Blues and the Greens. These fan bases were more than just spectators, they were political factions in motion. Supporting the Blues or Greens wasn't only about who had faster horses, it reflected your political affiliations, religious views, and even your neighbourhood. These rivalries occasionally exploded into violence. The infamous Nika riots of 532 started as a sports riot and ended with nearly half the city burned down and 30,000 people lost their lives. Religion shaped daily life, but perhaps not in the way we might imagine. While theological debates raged among the educated elite, ordinary Byzantines practiced a faith that mixed official doctrine with folk traditions and superstitions. People wore amulets for protection, consulted local holy people for advice, and participated in religious festivals that often incorporated pre-Christian elements. The official church might have frowned, but pragmatic priests often looked the other way. The average Byzantine wasn't obsessing over whether Christ had one nature or two. They were praying for a good harvest, a healthy baby, or protection from the plague. And speaking of health, public bathhouses remained a central feature of Byzantine life. These were inherited from Roman traditions. More than places to just get clean, they served as social hubs where people of all classes, though usually segregated by gender, could relax, gossip, and even conduct business. Let's discuss this over a steam was the Byzantine equivalent of let's do lunch. The Byzantine mind. While Western Europe was fumbling through the post-Roman hangover, Constantinople was developing a distinctive intellectual culture that approached problems fundamentally differently than either its Roman predecessors or its medieval European contemporaries. The Byzantine mind was deeply symbolic, seeing the physical world as a reflection of divine realities. Rather than just a religious view, it functioned as an all-encompassing mode of understanding, where the emerging Western intellectual traditions would eventually emphasize categorization, linear thinking, and cause-effect relationships. Byzantine thought excelled at seeing patterns, correspondences, and harmonies between seemingly unrelated things. Take Byzantine art as a window into this mental framework. To modern Western eyes, Byzantine icons initially look wrong. The perspective is deliberately inverted, proportions are symbolically rather than anatomically determined, and gold backgrounds define natural settings. But these weren't artistic limitations, they were conscious choices reflecting a different way of seeing reality. The inverted perspective places the viewer, not the image, at the vanishing point, suggesting that the holy figure is looking at you, not the other way around. Byzantine artists weren't trying and failing to be realistic. They were rejecting mere physical representation in favour of depicting spiritual realities. This symbolic thinking extended to politics, diplomacy, and everyday life. Court ceremonies weren't just pomp, they were enacted cosmos, mirroring what the Byzantines believed were the divine order of heaven. The emperor's position relative to others, the colours he wore, the timing of his movements, all carried layers of meaning that educated Byzantines could read as clearly as we read text. Byzantine education reflected this distinctive approach. While Western medieval education eventually organised itself around the 7 liberal arts, Byzantine education centred in encyclopedic knowledge and rhetorical skill. A well-educated Byzantine wasn't expected to innovate so much as to synthesise, to see connections between diverse fields of knowledge and articulate them persuasively. The ideal wasn't the specialist, but the polymath, who could quote Homer, debate theology, appreciate mathematics, and compose elegant poetry. This intellectual framework had profound strengths and weaknesses. On one hand, it created remarkable stability. Byzantine culture maintained essential continuity for over 1,000 years, preserving Greek learning when much of Europe had forgotten it. On the other hand, it could resist innovation, seeing novel approaches as potentially dangerous deviations from established harmony. Perhaps most importantly, the Byzantine mind approached contradictions differently than most of us do. Where modern Western thinking, which is influenced by Aristotelian logic, sees contradictions as problems to be resolved, Byzantine thought was more comfortable with paradox, with holding seemingly opposite truths in tension. More than ambiguity, it reflected a worldview that honoured the sacred in contradiction. Christ could be fully human and fully divine. The emperor could be both servant and master. Icons could be both material objects and windows to heaven. This distinctive cognitive framework wasn't limited to academic elites. It shaped how ordinary Byzantines experienced the world, processed information, and made decisions. It functioned like a mental operating system, enabling Constantinople to create a unique civilization at the crossroads of East and West, ancient and medieval, preserving classical knowledge while transforming it into something new. When the walls fell. The fall of Constantinople in 1453 marked more than the end of an empire. It was a collective trauma that rewired Europe's cultural consciousness. When those supposedly impenetrable walls finally gave way to Ottoman cannons after a millennium of resistance, what collapsed wasn't merely stone, it was an entire worldview. For Eastern Christians, particularly the Orthodox, the loss of Constantinople felt apocalyptic. Many interpreted it as a sign of the end times, the fall of the Second Rome. The psychological devastation was akin to what modern Americans might feel if Washington, D.C. were to fall to a foreign power, except amplified by religious significance and a history stretching back over 1,000 years. The Byzantine emperor embodied more than political leadership. He was the protector of Orthodox Christianity, his office established by God himself. His fall created a vacuum of both political and spiritual authority that would never be fully filled. In Western Europe, the reaction was more complex. On one level, many Catholic Europeans had long viewed their Eastern Christian counterparts with suspicion, even hostility. Centuries of growing division, doctrinal, cultural, and political, had created a deep mistrust. Earlier conflicts, including a particularly brutal episode in which Western Crusaders turned on the city they were meant to protect, had left scars that were still fresh in the collective memory. Some even saw the city's fall as divine punishment for the East's refusal to accept Rome's spiritual authority. Yet beneath this theological finger-pointing lay a deeper anxiety. Constantinople had been the buffer between Europe and the Islamic world, an arrangement that had allowed Western European powers to develop with relative security on their eastern flank. With Constantinople gone, the Ottoman Empire now had direct access to Central Europe, evidenced by their subsequent pushes as far as Vienna. Suddenly, the Islamic world wasn't a distant reality but an immediate neighbour, and a powerful one at that. The fall also triggered a massive brain drain as Byzantine scholars fled west, bringing with them ancient Greek texts and ideas that would help fuel the Renaissance. This intellectual migration created a strange contradiction. Western Europe was simultaneously absorbing Byzantine intellectual treasures while developing narratives that distanced themselves from Byzantium's perceived failures. Perhaps most significantly, Constantinople's fall shattered the medieval assumption that Christian dominance was part of the natural order. If the greatest Christian city, the one that had stood for a millennium, could fall to Islamic forces, then perhaps Christianity's position wasn't as secure as Europeans had assumed. This existential uncertainty contributed to the psychological conditions that would eventually birth both the Reformation and the Counter-Reformation, as Western Christianity struggled to redefine itself in a world where its dominance could no longer be taken for granted. The cultural processing of this trauma took many forms. In Russia, Moscow began to position itself as the Third Rome, the heir to Constantinople's spiritual authority. Two Romes have fallen, the third stands, and a fourth there shall not be, went the famous proclamation. This narrative would shape Russian self-identity for centuries, influencing everything from imperial ambitions to art and architecture. In Western Europe, the fall of Constantinople became both a cautionary tale and a romantic tragedy. It was simultaneously evidence of Eastern decadence and corruption, a narrative that conveniently absolved the West of responsibility for failing to provide adequate aid, and a last heroic stand of Christian civilization against the advancing Ottoman tide. This dual narrative allowed Europeans to mourn Constantinople while distancing themselves from its fate. The trauma echoed for centuries in art, literature, and collective memory. Even today, the fall of Constantinople remains a touchstone in discussions of civilizational decline, religious conflict, and historical turning points. Few events have so dramatically illustrated how a single city could embody not just political power, but the psychological foundation of an entire worldview. The fall of Constantinople didn't just end an empire. It crystallized religious divisions that had been growing for centuries. While Moscow proclaimed itself the Third Rome and Western Europe processed its complex grief, the rift between Eastern and Western Christianity, already widening by theological disputes, cultural differences, and competing visions of religious authority, became seemingly unbridgeable. What had begun as subtle variations in practice and perspective had hardened into the Great Schism, a religious divorce that would reshape the spiritual landscape of Europe and the Middle East for centuries to come. Thank you for listening to Beyond the Narrative.